Welcome, everyone. My name is Kiersten Marek, and I'm the founder and editor of Philanthropy Women. And today we are going to discuss faith and philanthropy, living your beliefs through your giving. So I'm really excited about our conversation today. We have some amazing guest speakers. So there is so much going on in philanthropy and faith that can accelerate gender equality movements. We know that still the largest portion of charity in our country goes through churches. So when we can bring a gender lens into these faith communities, we can often sort of kill two birds with one stone, to use an unfortunate metaphor, and really join causes and bring together new ideas that are very valuable. So I'd like to start today just by telling you a little bit about my faith journey. So I was raised Catholic, and my mother had joined the convent 2 times. My father had been a priest at Marquette before becoming a professor of education. From about 2000 to today, I was a member of the Episcopal Church with my family, and we were really happy there because they had a great choir program that we could use. And so that was really helpful. I'm just going to stop for a second. Callie, can you make sure my screen is up? Because I'm getting, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so basically, I thought the Episcopal Church was a really great leader. They have a very strong LGBTQ stand. And I was actually a teacher in the church school for over 10 years. And during that time, we actually had one of our students transition their gender. So I felt like I played a really effective role, and I got a lot out of it. My children were in the choir. But what happened for us is basically after our daughters grew up, our younger daughter did not want to go to church, didn't want to be in the choir. And I just started to consider what this really meant to me. And I sat in church one day, I realized that I said the words father and son about 40 times in an hour. And I thought, like, is this really a valuable use of my time? So that's when we had sort of a family discussion, and we decided that we were going to shift our philanthropy to funding women and girls. So we now fund the Women's Funding Network, the Women's Fund of Rhode Island, and also the Ms. Foundation. And I personally feel so much more aligned spiritually since we've turned our funding to gender equality. So that's my story. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers who are going to share a little bit about their story and how their philanthropy informs their giving. Their philanthropy informs their spirituality. So I'd like to start with Emily Nielsen Jones, and Emily actually can't be with us today because she has her son graduating from college, but she is going to, I'm going to bring up a video of her. So Emily Nielsen Jones is a donor activist engaged in promoting human equality, justice, and peace around the world. She is particularly passionate and engaged in the nexus of faith, gender, and development, and working to mobilize faith traditions to more fully and unambiguously embrace gender equality. Emily is the co-founder of Imago Fund, and they have a gender lens on all of their giving. Much of it is global and collaborates with spiritual movements to bring gender equality to those communities. Emily is also a member of Women Moving Millions, the Women Donors Network, and a newly formed Refugee Funders Alliance, where she is working to create a COVID-19 fund focused on getting funding to women's groups on the front lines of refugee response.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Emily Nielsen Jones. I am the co-founder of the Imago Fund, and I am so honored to be on this panel with all of you. My apologies that I am not able to be live with you, but given our topic, I can say that I am with you all in spirit. Looking over your bios of everyone on the panel, I do feel a kinship with all of you. And I'm so honored to be on this panel with you to linger over this nexus that we are all engaged in between faith and philanthropy and probably feminism. I'd add that to the mix. Hopefully this is appearing at the end of the lineup, and I will just try to add a few insights into the mix that hopefully build on what you all have shared. Let me first just add 2 deep bows of gratitude to Kiersten for convening this panel and for the deep, soulful values that you bring to your work at Philanthropy Women. I also want to do a shout out to my friend and mentor in women's philanthropy, to Helen LaKelly Hunt. She was there for me when we started our foundation and really helped validate my calling and just give me language for what it was I was doing at this nexus of faith and philanthropy and feminism, which I see as laden with a lot of contradictions that we all need to navigate. So I guess for my time, I'd just share a little bit about how I've been navigating some of these contradictions around faith and philanthropy and gender. I'll start by sharing some insights about my own journey and then share a little bit about what our foundation has been doing, and hopefully this will relate to everything you have all talked about. So let's see. So we started our foundation, the Imago Day Fund, in 2009. And this was a year, as you know, 2008 was a challenging year. The economic recession, Occupy movement. And for me, I was navigating a lot in my own journey. In my early 30s, I had gone through what I kind of, looking back, consider to be like a spiritual awakening. To others, it looked like I was doubting and backsliding. But for me, it was this really liberating time where I was asking myself, how do I know this God I believe in? I don't know if that makes sense. I grew up in evangelicalism, and I had this edifice of beliefs in my brain. And probably in my late 20s, it started to not be that meaningful, but sorry, I'm outside. You hear the train and the noise. I just started, something gave me this sense of like, I think I've been missing something. I've been sitting in the pews for 3 decades and more, and I just was really curious, and I became a seeker in many ways. And I just was reading all sorts of books, and I had this insight at one point that what am I seeking? In some ways it's God, but it's also my own soul. And something gave me this inner freedom to just reformat my beliefs, maybe update my operating system. And I found myself letting go of beliefs that I never really believed or resonated with, but were sort of inserted into my brain because, you know, if you yourself are part of maybe a more conservative religious tradition, you know there are certain beliefs that you have to believe. So for me, it was a challenging time, but it was also just a deeply empowering time. And at this time, I found myself not only feeling angst and some challenge around what I consider to be false certitudes of the religion that I was brought up in, but also right behind that was the economic rules of the road. So I found myself just, looking more deeply at things. And at the same time, I was coming more into awareness of our own wealth accumulation as a family, and just started asking questions. And it was around the time of the Occupy movement. So I found myself really drawn to what are they saying? And it basically led us to have, my husband and I, to have conversations around this angst I was having, which led to the creation of our foundation, the Imago Day Fund. And you probably recognize that there's a spiritual meaning there in the foundation. Imago Dei is Latin for image of God. And wrapped up in that word is my own finding myself, finding the spark of the divine within myself. And it's a universal term. For me, what it means is really seeing the spark of the divine in the shared humanity that we all have as an endowment. And in particular, our shared humanity that's really trying to roll up our sleeves and make the world a better place, move oppressive mountains that really undermine our shared humanity. There's also a sense in the name, or just in our motivation, our faith inspiration of being good stewards, that this wealth, these resources we have are not our own, but they belong to God, the sacred, and we want to steward them. So we consider our foundation faith-inspired, not faith-based. And there's a nuance there, but it basically says that's our motivation. But from the beginning, we've been kind of straddling the secular and the religious world of social change, and really just probably at the sweet spot of our philanthropy is finding and getting to know and partner with inspired local leaders who want to be and are the change in their own cultures and religions. So sometimes that looks like, faith leaders, other times it's, social entrepreneurs, but they all have something that to me is the spark of the divine in them. I guess I'll share a little bit at this in the beginning stages after we started our foundation. I was very honored to be part of networks like Women Moving Millions that Helen LaKelly Hunt helped to start with her sister and others. And, just was lucky to go on some donor trips and meet local leaders. And early on, I was deeply inspired by a lot of the faith-inspired organizations we were interacting with, but I encountered this deep sorrow and heartbreak as I really came to understand how severe and harsh patriarchy still is around the world. And then also within my own tradition, I started seeing the needle going backwards around gender equality in my own religious pond, American evangelicalism, and something kicked my butt into gear to say we need to do more. This is not okay to see the needle going backwards for girls and women in a world where life is so tenuous already for so many people. Poverty and patriarchy are cruel masters. So we started doubling down and doing more around gender equality within the church, and really fell in love with and just am so inspired by these scrappy, faith-inspired change agents around the world that are moving mountains just by being who they are and also tapping into their faith. I think I'm going on too long, so I'll just end by saying a few things that we've done in our foundation. The first thing I wanted to say was just by asking the question about gender balance on the board, gender balance within the organization. And, again, it was kind of stunning at times to see how organizations that are working to rescue women and girls from trafficking and brothels still, had some barriers with their own organization. And one thing we did was we sponsored a study in partnership with Gordon College to look at the gender balance or lack thereof within faith-based nonprofits in the U.S. And you can find that online. Not surprisingly, what we found was that in every category, the gender imbalance was twice as bad in faith-based organizations. Let's see, what else have we done? Again, just this looking for local change agents that know how to language feminism in their own religious and cultural forms. And we really have evolved to really double down on wanting to get away from supporting, Western-led NGOs that are doing great work. We still do support many like that, but we really are wanting to do more to support local change agents in their own culture. And I'm over time, I have started a project with a minister from Kenya named Reverend Dominic Masolo called The Girl Child and Her Long Walk to Freedom. And it's a reading journey that starts on International Day of the Girl in October and ends on International Women's Day in March. And the idea is to journey with the girl child, and that term represents the spark of the divine in the feminine that we're all born with, that knows its own equality, but there are still norms and traditions that need to change. And it uses the Exodus journey in the Bible to say, we need to go back and look at this slavery that goes back, to the early cradles of civilization, and really see it, lament it, and determine to root out these contradictions in our own religious traditions. And from that awareness to go on the Exodus journey to say, what is ours to do to truly mainstream and welcome the girl child at all stages of her life into the ranks of the freeborn. So anyway, we've done 3 cohorts of that. And the whole idea is to really spark dialogue and awareness and give faith-inspired leaders a space to reflect on their own religious journey and spiritual journey and their activist journey, and tap into like this deeper kernel of what is faith. It isn't our beliefs, it's something deeper. When Jesus said, if you have faith like this little seed, you can move mountains. That's what we're hoping to really tap into. And I will end on that note. Blessings. Bye.
So thank you for Emily for that. And now we are going to continue on with our next speaker. Next, we are here to welcome and very grateful to have with us Dr. Helen LaKelly Hunt. Dr. Helen LaKelly Hunt is one of a small army of women who helped to seed the women's funding movement. She co-founded the Texas Women's Foundation, the New York Women's Foundation, the Women's Funding Network, and Women Moving Millions. Helen is the author of Faith and Feminism, A Holy Alliance, and her latest book, And the Spirit Moved Them, The Lost Radical History of America's First Feminists, shares the inspiring story of the abolitionist feminists. With her partner, Harville Hendricks, Helen has also authored several books on improving relationships. She and Harville are now working to disseminate safe conversations, a process that can help anyone shift from conflict to connection. So welcome, Helen. Can you, I need my daughter to help unmute. Can you unmute, Helen? There we go. There we go. Welcome, Helen.
Hi, it's an honor to be here with you. So just diving in, you just gave a little bit about my background, but I will mention before that, I am part of a family-owned business, Hunt Oil Company, and over time, profits of the company came to family members. And so suddenly in the 1980s, I learned I was going to be getting distributions. So I thought, well, what do I do? And someone said there was an organization, the Council on Foundations, and they meet every year. So I went to one of those, and there were all these people, and there was a place where there were, and like Kellogg Foundation brought 50 annual reports, and Ford Foundation brought 50, and private foundations. And I thought, I don't want to really listen to seminars. I think I'll take copies of the annual report, go to my room and order room service. So that's what I did on the whole conference practically. And I was reading them, and all of the boards were white males, Caucasians. So I thought, but that's normal. Men control money. I didn't think anything of it until near the end of the pile. There was, I opened up the Women's Fund from San Francisco, and women were on the board, and women of different races. And I just started crying. Just tears came to my eyes. And I thought, oh, this is one of the most important things happening on the planet. So I called someone from the organization. I was living in Dallas, and she came and she spoke to us. And after many months of meeting, we gave birth to the Dallas Women's Foundation, which, as Kiersten said, became the Texas Women's Foundation. I moved to New York. And so suddenly I just thought, I've got to support this vision. And someone in New York said, we want to start a New York Women's Foundation. I said, I don't know anyone here. And she said, I know everybody. And she did. So the New York Women's Foundation got bored. And then they wanted me on the Women's Funding Network. I was on their first board. And I was doing all. And suddenly I woke up and, oh, I'm in the world of feminism. That's interesting. I'm suddenly in the middle of feminism. I was on the board of the Miss Foundation. It's not where I thought I would be spending my time. And I was a woman of faith. And I noticed there were a lot of agendas in feminism at the time, and it didn't include women of faith. And so I decided to write a book, about women I consider feminist, like Teresa of Avila, and Sojourner Truth, and different women of faith that I consider feminist. So I was working on a manuscript. Gloria Steinem called, and she said, can we have tea? I said, yeah. We met. She said, do not do this. Please don't write a book on women of faith, or about faith and feminism. I said, Gloria, why not? And she said, it's the most patriarchal structure on the planet. Women can't thrive in a church. I said, oh, Gloria, thank you for having tea. I'll think about what you've said. And I thought about it. Anyway, eventually, the book got published, and she was willing to do the foreword. And I think I'm keep this confidential, I think I'm the only person that's ever edited Gloria Steinem. She kept sending me forwards, and I thought, I would like to tweak this sentence a little bit. And I'd go, Gloria, could I tweak this sentence? And she went, okay. And then I had never worked with Betty Friedan. I barely knew her, but I asked her to do something, and she said, oh, Helen, and she's on the book cover. She said, oh, Helen, thank you for writing a book on faith and feminism. There will never be equality on this realm unless we have equality on the heavenly realm. And so women need to show up in their houses of worship and demand equality, lift up their voices, get their voices up. So, so basically, the United Nations came to me. They were, every 5 years there was a conference of women, and in 1995 there was a Beijing conference, and they talked with me about doing a study at the conference, women of faith, feminists who are feminists of faith explicitly, and feminists that don't identify as women of faith. Do they work in partnership? Do they work on parallel tracks, or they work antagonistically against each other? And these forms were filled out, on these women signed it, and they said why they felt that way. Not one survey that was turned in said those two categories, feminist who don't express anything about religious faith, and feminists who do express something about their religion, belief in faith. Not one woman said they worked collaboratively. And so the United Nations published this study. So they belong together. They need each other. And I just respect Kiersten so much, and Philanthropy women. I think I will my closing comments will be, I just sort of, at one point, I just couldn't believe that there weren't more feminists in history. So I thought, I'm going to study the religious roots of American feminism. I think I'll study it, and I might even do a doctoral dissertation about it. So I did that because Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who catalyzed suffrage, she said that let's see, my notes are that the suffrage movement needed to vitalize not only political but theological concerns that include women's values in society. And she was convinced that there must be a balance with all sectors of society, including religious institutions, for there to be healing in the culture. And Susan B. said, don't say that in public. and they kept sort of elbowing each other off the panel, the podium. But so she was there, so I said, okay, I'm gonna study this. And sort of my last comments are that I decided to do this doctorate on the religious roots of American feminism. I'm studying in a rare book collection. I accidentally discovered a part of women's history that had never been written about. And it was the abolitionist feminist. It was the anti-slavery women. And I accidentally discovered, and Kiersten knows, the proceedings of the first American Convention of Women occurred 13 years before Seneca Falls. And these were women who wanted to speak out against slavery, which was controversial at the time. They were slaves. This was before the Civil War. And these were women in the North. And when they wanted to support their husbands who were creating abolitionist societies, they would work with their husbands and they cared passionately about this. But then when it was time for the members to sign up and become members of an abolitionist society, they wouldn't let the women sign, even though they had planned for the meeting, brought food, done the minutes, but they were not considered equal. And these women got sick and tired of that, and they started their own female anti-slavery societies. And they began to spread. And when they would meet as a group, mobs would come and throw rocks in the window and yell and scream and say, "Get out of town, get out of here, you cannot speak out." But they were against slavery too. They just didn't want the women speaking. Imagine. And so lastly, these women said, if my husband says I'm not supposed to speak in public, my culture says I can't speak in public, my church says I can't speak in public, but God is telling me I must speak out. And this is a cause worth dying for. So I did a dissertation on these women who were lost to history, but their faith fueled their feminism. Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, I'm about to cry, at the end of his life said, if it were not for the anti-slavery women, abolitionists may never have happened. So women have something special to give to the culture. And Philanthropy Women, with Kiersten at the helm, she just pulls out the important things. So thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was beautiful. And I love the fact that those early abolitionists were coming from a faith place. So that really says so much. Next, I would like to introduce Yolanda F. Johnson. Yolanda has more than 2 decades of experience in the nonprofit sector. And in addition to leading her own consulting business, Yolanda is the founder of Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy, also the founder of Allies in Action Membership Network, and the president of Women in Development New York, the New York City area's premier professional organization for women in fundraising and philanthropy. Yolanda has also had an outstanding career as a performing artist, as a composer, producer, educator, and she has used her background as a performer to become a sought-after fundraiser and philanthropy expert. So welcome, Yolanda, and please share with us a little bit about your experience with how your faith can inform your giving.
Thank you so much for that, Kiersten. It's a pleasure to be here. Honored to be here with all of you and with my fellow speakers today. I will talk a little bit about the origins of my faith, my relationship with faith and the role of women and faith and money, which started in the evangelical realm. I'm Baptist. I was raised from a family of theologians, and primarily by my grandfather, who was a Baptist minister from the South, not a Southern Baptist, but a Baptist minister from the South. And it was very interesting because they were all very much, the King James only folks. There's a whole club of people that feel that way about translations and interpretations of scripture. And what was mostly interesting about my grandfather and how he raised me was this paradox. It was so strange. It's really an issue that so many women from similar backgrounds have told me, that men in their family have shared the same issue, where I was always taught that women can't, except for you. Where men are very supportive of their daughters and of women in their family, primarily daughters, I think, but yet they have this sort of chauvinistic take and misogynistic take on everything else about women. And so I probably gave him a bit of a headache as I was growing up and following my own path, because I finally had to look him in the face and say, we used to have we get in our pajamas and get our Bibles out and talk about scripture and different issues and things in the world. And I finally had to tell him, guess what, Grandpa? Women can. It's not just me. I am not special in that sense. And what we have to realize and share is that women can. Just fill in the blank, Grandpa. Love you, but this one's a little bit off. And so, when you point to scripture as far as the role of women and the role of money, I've always found it fascinating, and in my journey, I think a big turning point was the resurrection. For Christians, when you really look, and who was it that reported that Christ had been raised from the dead? It was women. And the role that women played, not being recognized in the courts, really, their place in society was such that, that was, thanks, Helen. If they were going to lie about it or fabricate a story, you wouldn't have said women are the ones that saw it all happen. So that was a turning point for me also. And then when you look at the life of Christ and the role that women played, it just, it's always taught me that women matter. Women are important. People matter, whatever your past is. We live in such a cancel culture, but we have a place, regardless of whatever's happened before, to live out our lives and our purpose. And so along with that King James mentality was 10% the tithe, that you must give or you will be cursed type of situation. You go back to the story of Ananias falling dead because they cheated the Lord and didn't pay their money. And so that had been ingrained in me, and the loveliest thing has happened over time, especially with my career in philanthropy and even in my own personal prayer closet. What has come to me is, at the crux of it all, is generosity. And so that is what I try to live out, that thought of generosity, looking back to, and looking at the New Testament, 2 Corinthians, about the Lord loving a cheerful giver. So how do you give cheerfully? And how do you give in a philanthropic landscape where, yes, church giving is very high. It's at the top. We know that from Giving USA and all of the reports. But how do I discern how I'm supposed to be giving to get the good work done when churches may not still play the same role in a lot of the social activity that was happening before, historically? And so I've always seen it as an opportunity to delve deeper into your own life of faith, to discern how it is that you are supposed to be generous. And how can you be creative around that generosity? I've done things like commission new works of music for musicians that I know needed the work. And that's the way that I wanted to give back. And maybe it was based upon some scripture if they were interested in that, or just to support them. I think that justice matters. I certainly ascribe to Matthew 23:23 that it may not be 10%, but when Christ said, when Jesus said, you pay your tithes, and yet what's lacking? Faithfulness and mercy and justice. Justice matters. So philanthropy without justice and mercy and love and faithfulness, just like faith without works, is dead. It's just some cash that you put over there. We'll see what happens. But I also believe that Christ, that God, is a pragmatist. And so understanding that the world does need money to go around. So, you don't have to limit yourself to the Mosaic covenant anymore. And that was a big thing for me, is just understanding that there's not necessarily a dollar amount tied to it. I just need to be generous, whatever that means. And as far as supporting women, much of my life and my work is about supporting women and championing women. It's just something that resonates with me and has always been important for me. And it goes back to Grandpa looking down on me, but women can. And we have to sometimes nudge in that seat at the table for each other and champion each other. When it comes to justice in the church, the evangelical church, the Baptist church right now, it's been a bit of a conundrum. Because you have things like the Southern Baptist Convention not addressing, not adhering to, not accepting critical race theory. A lot of people leaving because of that. Everyone makes their own decisions, but when it comes to justice, it matters. And as a church and as people of faith, I think one of the most beautiful ways we can express that for fellow women and for anyone who has experienced injustice is to use those dollars really strategically. And so that's one of the personal goals that I have in my own philanthropy and the philanthropy that I encourage in clients and in others, is to be creative, have fun with this. The Lord loves a cheerful giver, and then the abundance comes. So how can I champion a woman? What are the women doing? What's going on over here? What women-owned businesses and women of color-owned businesses can I support? Who can I get behind? Who can I push forward? Who can I spotlight? Who can I champion? And so I've gotten to be colloquial, I've gotten a real kick out of that. I love that. I've established a fund. I named it the Agape Fund because it was just about love with a women's organization, a music organization, of which I'm part, because I thought that was important. And, even with the way that money is given, it has some guidelines, but it's pretty open because it's just to help and express that love through a vetting process, but just to be there for people. And when it gets back to that 10%, the other thing that I've learned so much in my faith journey is, from a theological perspective, if you want a benchmark, a baseline, then I think that's a good place to start. But I just love knowing that I have the freedom that I don't have to necessarily adhere to that. I need to be generous. And generous for each of us as individuals can look like a lot of different things. And so I think that, the perspective of faith is to be God's hands and feet and eyes, moving things forward in the world, remembering that our philanthropy must include that faithfulness and that justice and that love, and that can translate to being very strategic, to champion women and all the work that they're doing in the world today, has been something that's very important to me and something that I try to live out in my life and in the work in philanthropy that I do. And so I think that is what I will share with you today. I hope that it's been helpful in some way.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yolanda. Yes, very helpful. Our next speaker is Jane Karlin. And let me just get my screen up. Jane F. Karlin has enjoyed a distinguished career raising funds and leading institutional advancement programs in secular and faith-based organizations. Since her first development role at Pace University, she has held senior positions at New York University, Hadassah, Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion, and the Jewish Agency for Israel. So welcome, Jane, and tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, how do faith and philanthropy mesh for you?
Great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to join this panel and to be with women whom I really admire. I didn't start out as thinking I was going to be very much involved in what I call faith-based philanthropy, because professionally, I, quote, fell into Jewish fundraising when the former provost of Hunter College of the City University of New York, someone who I admired academically, called me about joining Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization of America, about which I really knew very little. And my first reaction was, I'm Jewish, Dr. Shore, but I don't know if I'm Jewish enough for Hadassah. I thought it was a much more religious organization than it is. It's actually quite mixed. And she said, well, I want to hire somebody from the university world, and you've been recommended. And that was really my first introduction to working for a faith-based organization. And Hadassah built the healthcare system of the state of Israel when it was Palestine, and it continues to this day to have 2 hospitals that provide healthcare to Jews, non-Jews, Israeli Arabs, people of all faiths who come from all over the world for their breakthrough treatments, and in stealth operations to Arab patients across borders. And that was my introduction. But growing up, I came from what I would say an assimilated Reform family. We were synagogue affiliated, but I was not terribly well educated in Jewish text, which was very common for women of my baby boomer age. We weren't bat mitzvahed, maybe we were confirmed. Again, it was a male-oriented tradition. But somehow the sense of giving Jewishly was also in my DNA. On a personal level, in synagogue, I hear my father's voice. During holidays, I cook the same recipes that my mother cooked. And God knows she was not a great cook, but she had a few signature Jewish holiday recipes. And L'dor v'dor is a catchphrase of our faith, meaning from generation to generation. And I'm so pleased when my adult kids ask me to repeat the golden oldies each year. My upbringing reflected what many Jews reported in the last Pew Research survey in 2013, that the top 3 responses for what it means to be Jewish included 73% said remembering the Holocaust. Again, in my generation, it was very common if you lived in New York to know someone whose family was personally impacted by the Holocaust. 69% ascribe being Jewish to leading an ethical life, and 54% of Jews surveyed say working for justice and equality is essential to leading a Jewish life. So you might say it's a bit in the DNA. It's clearly in Jewish texts and traditions. In Deuteronomy, we read tzedek, tzedek tirdaf, justice, justice you shall pursue, which Ruth Bader Ginsburg had in a piece of art on her wall in her Supreme Court chamber. Jewish concepts of justice are rooted in our oldest teachings about human relations and worship rituals. And they're powerful metaphors in the Bible for water. We all remember Dr. Martin Luther King saying, "Let justice well up like water and righteousness like a flowing stream." Of 613 commandments in Judaism, the very, very first is charity is equal in importance to all other commandments combined. And we read in the Torah about the 4 matriarchs who helped form our faith: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Rhea. For me, giving Jewishly and getting involved in Jewish organizations was about women role models and women's organizations whom I admired. My mother, who was quite secular in her upbringing, more so than my father, who had a fairly rigid early religious background, was very involved in the area's National Council of Jewish Women, working on social justice issues and interfaith relations. We lived in Rockville Center, New York, which was the seat of the Long Island Diocese. So there were many opportunities for contact with strong Catholic organizations in the community. I saw the work they did, and I saw how they enjoyed working together. They embodied the characteristics of Sandra Shaw Hardy's and Martha Taylor's research on women in philanthropy long before the book was written. In our movement in 1819, Jewish women organized the first communal organization to help sisters in need, and they didn't stop marching since then. Hadassah trips to Israel inspired me and moved me to tears to see the work that was done. Although I will admit, I'm highly critical of Israel's foreign policy and domestic policy. And as a member of the Reform Jewish movement in a Reform synagogue, I simply found a home that strengthened my voice and let me meet women whose energy, whose commitment to social justice, to spirituality, I could deeply, deeply admire. As I think about my faith-based giving today, it's not enough for it to rest on what I draw from faith, the spiritual sustenance, a sense of community of like-minded women, or a window into the existential, which I don't understand. I don't know if I believe in God or not, but I know I'm deeply spiritual. But my faith-based giving must remain relevant, unafraid to face lingering and new challenges, such as Black Lives Matter, ongoing issues like gender pay equity. I also expect my faith-based organizations to operate in accordance with what we would call nonprofit best practices. They don't get a pass just because they're faith-based. So I'm affiliated with Women of Reform Judaism, which in 1913 became the auxiliary organization of the Reform Movement Union for Reform Judaism, as it's called today. And WRJ is committed to funding programs that involve women and girls. And they're committed to funding with what they call a progressive lens. And to give you just some of the examples, in 2015, they joined with the Women's Rabbinic Network, which is a group of women rabbis throughout the Reform movement, to take on the issue of gender pay equity. Sadly, the Reform movement has not been immune from that grievous issue. Women in the clergy, Jewish education, and Jewish communal organizations have been victimized and continue to be challenged to pay, to receive what they deserve. We also work with secular organizations like women's foundations to take on the matter. Over the past few months, Women of Reform Judaism piloted a diversity, equity, and inclusion grant-making project. Every year, we give several $100,000 away that we raise to partner organizations in the Reform movement, again, to further the efforts of women and girls. However, this year we said we need to break out of that mold. We need to reach smaller, more relevant social Jewish organizations that are struggling to survive, struggling to grow, and who are interested in issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over 50 smaller organizations responded to our RFP, and we funded initiatives in support of Jews who identify as Jews of color, as Asian American Jews, and underwrote an anti-racism project to produce Jewish music programming for young children. Through WRJ's involvement in the larger Religious Action Center, which is a product of the Union of Reform Judaism, we're at the forefront of issues to address women's health and a right to choose, and the suppression of voting rights, as well as systemic racism. Local WRJ groups reach out to synagogues and mosques to engage their women in interfaith programming. And I believe we're going to see even more of this in response to the intense polarization in American communities around political beliefs and heightened racial tensions. There are many wonderful nonprofit organizations that address issues that are important to me that have to do with social justice and advocacy. And I do give outside of the Jewish community, particularly to my undergraduate college where I'm very involved. But for me, giving to a faith-based organization, to Women of Reform Judaism, as well as my local synagogue, but primarily to Women of Reform Judaism, I must admit it's like one-stop shopping. It allows me to fulfill my spiritual needs, but it also allows me to band with others, to learn from other women, to respect the history of the past as I try to contribute to creating a more just social order for my children and my grandchildren. And it allows me to model to my children, and I hope ultimately to my grandchildren, that women have voices, that women have power, and that women can use money. And I just want to end by saying, and going back to something that Helen said earlier about Betty Friedan and equity in the spiritual realm. In 1971, a professor at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, which is the flagship seminary for the Reform movement, wrote an essay called "The Jew Who Wasn't There." And she argued that feminists should not run from religion, but rather embrace the fact that women need to have meaningful places in the practice of faith. And she was also one of the prime movers in 2008 when something called the Woman's Torah Commentary was published. And it was a woman's interpretation of the Torah and giving voice to many, many women who may not have sufficiently seen themselves in Judaism. So on that note, I do believe that one can be a feminist, a champion of social justice, and also someone who believes that faith, however she defines it, is important and meaningful and must be sustained. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. Our last speaker today is Nikki Toyama-Szeto. Nikki Toyama-Szeto is the Executive Director of Christians for Social Action, a network of scholars and activists. She helps Christians have a faith-fueled engagement with social justice issues. So welcome, Nikki, and tell us a little bit about your experience with blending faith and philanthropy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I bring you greetings from just outside the Washington, D.C. area. The organization that I lead, Christians for Social Action, was started in 1973, and it had four main priorities. The first was the promotion of equity for women within the Christian faith, the fighting of racism, the fighting of the increasing militarization that was happening, as well as engaging with income inequality or trying to eradicate poverty. And that was in 1973. The organization at that time was called Evangelicals for Social Action, and we have, under my leadership, have changed the name to Christians for Social Action as an act of hospitality to the larger community that we're working with. As Kiersten said, we work to help people have a faith-fueled engagement with justice issues. And as we're talking about philanthropy, activism, and what it means to be women in the midst of that, I wanted to share something that is, for me, sort of this convergent space that we're discussing. I'm Japanese American, fourth generation. My grandparents were part of the mass incarceration of Japanese during World War II in the United States. This is a picture that for me helps to inform my engagement with the justice issues today. This is a picture in a Japanese printmaking style by an artist named Watanabe, and this is Elizabeth with Mary. And the story goes that Mary, when she found herself in a predicament that no one else could relate to, when she found herself navigating a path that no one else had to walk, she went and found her cousin, who was just a few months ahead of her on the journey. And it was in that relationship, staying with her cousin, that Mary found strength for a journey that no one else was requested to also journey. And this is something that I think is very common for women in these different spaces. And it is this image that comes from my faith that has sort of helped me have these categories. Who is the Elizabeth in my life, who is just a few months along or just a few steps ahead in the journey, who can share her insights? She's not a teacher. She's a relative, a family member who is journeying with me in the same direction. So when I'm feeling a little bit lonely in some of these places, that's one of the reference points that I go to as an activist, as a woman leader. One of the questions that I was sent beforehand is a little bit about the intersection of both faith as well as the racial justice journey and churches and what that looks like. And one of the examples that I wanted to share of is something that happened quite recently. On March 16th, a gunman in Atlanta shot down and killed 5 women of Asian descent. He was fueled by his Christian faith and by these different patriarchal concepts around sexuality and purity and that sort of thing. And from that place was motivated for this violence. This is in a season of increasing anti-Asian violence. And so a group of folks here in the DC area, we decided to gather for both a prayer vigil and a rally in Chinatown Park on Palm Sunday. And part of what we were trying to do was to be present and to give visibility to the community. We're responding from our faith tradition. The other thing that we were trying to do is we were really trying to center the voices of women of color, of Asian Christian women, because they were the ones who were right in the in-between space where these misogynistic views of women turned to violence, where racism became real, and the victims were Asian women. So it was a very powerful and prophetic gathering of both prayer, of giving honor to those who died, and of calling out against injustice. One of the things that was particularly powerful, and we saw this because we really centered the voices of women from all of the communities to be a part of this rally and prayer vigil, is it was really striking to me how when women show up, they are showing up, and they're not just showing up by themselves, but they are showing up and they are connected to the children that they are connected to, the future generations. And they are also connected to the past generations that they are honoring. I think there is a way that, and it's not exclusive to a gender, but I have appreciated, I think the social experience that women have gives them a recognition of the longer generations and fabrics and stories that they are a part of. And I think that's really powerful. In specific, that rally was, it was about embodiment and about being present and about being a witness. And that's the thing that I think, as I'm ending my remarks, that I sort of want to exhort this community or encourage this community in, because I think it's something that is uniquely one of the gifts that women bring to the table. It's about embodiment, whether that is an embodied activism, an embodied philanthropy, an embodied feminism, or an embodied faith. I think women make things concrete and actionable. We don't live in the realm of the theoretical. We can hang there and we can stay there, but we also, I think, recognize where reality hits the road because we live that every day. So I think one of my exhortations is that as we are pursuing philanthropy and faith and the intersection of justice, that we do think about the embodiment. And I think one of the ways that embodiment shows up has to do with women on boards, women in leadership, women at decision-making spaces, women on the ground. All of that is part of embodiment. But I think that embodiment is the prophetic antidote to patriarchy. Patriarchy and oppression can only live when we keep things in the realm of the theoretical, because no one who has seen women move and work would ever continue to support and perpetuate patriarchy. So I think it's this embodied presence that women bring that really is part of one of the great gifts we can give. As I'm working with women, particularly from the Christian tradition, two things that I love to do is I love to work with women, and I love to work with leaders, and I particularly love to help women leaders recognize the ways that where society or their faith may have told them that they are disqualified for leadership, those are the exact reasons why they are needed. Because when you feel like you have been told you're disqualified or not enough, it gives you a sensitivity to recognize and see the invisible things that happen to folks on the margin. And that's the kind of leadership that I think we really need moving us forward in our society.
Yes. Thank you so much, Nikki. That was a beautiful way to end and a wonderful word to focus on, embodiment. I think it's really the key is how we can articulate about that embodiment that we have carried for all time since we've been living in a patriarchy. And so thank you to everyone. I feel so honored to have listened to your voices today and gotten an enhanced sense of how you have brought your spirituality into your philanthropy. So I want to thank you all for being with us, and there will be a recording of this for anyone who missed it, and we also have live blogging which we will share with the audience. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.